wind howled across the battlefield, carrying with it the scent of blood and smoke. The sun was setting behind the Anatolian hills, painting the sky crimson, the same color that now soaked the earth. Among the countless corpses lay the broken banners of two once mighty armies, one of Sultan Bayezid, the Thunderbolt, and the other of his greatest rival, Emir Suleiman of Karaman. But it wasn't just the clash of steel that ended that day. It was the beginning of a darkness no one could imagine. The Sultan rode his black horse through the ruins, his eyes hard as polished stone. Around him, the moans of the dying echoed like distant whispers. He was victorious, but there was no joy in his triumph, only vengeance. For months, Suleiman had defied him, raiding Ottoman lands, mocking Bayezid's rule, and spreading rebellion. But it wasn't the rebellion that burned in Bayezid's heart. It was betrayal. Suleiman had once been his ally, his sworn brother in arms. They had fought side by side when the Mongols threatened the east, shared victories, and sealed their friendship with oaths under the same sky. But greed had poisoned everything. Suleiman's ambition grew faster than loyalty, and when Bayezid rose as Sultan, Suleiman could not bear to kneel. He broke his oath, took Bayezid's envoys hostage, and declared himself free from Ottoman rule. And to wound him deeper, he had sent Bayezid's messenger back, headless. That was the moment Bayezid swore revenge not only on the man, but on everything that bore his name. As his soldiers gathered the spoils of war, Bayezid asked one question, his voice sharp as the edge of a sword. "Where is she?" They knew who he meant. Suleiman was dead. His body had been found crushed under his fallen horse. But his wife, Layla, the woman whose beauty was said to calm storms, had been taken alive. The soldiers brought her forward, wrapped in a torn veil, her face pale and eyes wide with fear. She was not merely a prize of war. She was the symbol of his enemy's pride. Bayezid dismounted slowly, his armor glinting like dark fire. The soldiers around him stepped back, sensing the fury that simmered beneath his calm expression. Layla fell to her knees, trembling. "Mercy, my Sultan," she whispered. "I had no part in his rebellion." Bayezid stared at her for a long moment. Her voice was soft, broken, the kind that once might have moved him, but not now. Not after the blood of his soldiers had soaked the soil because of her husband's treachery. "Mercy?" he repeated quietly. "Did your husband show mercy when he sent my men's heads on spears? When he burned my cities?" Tears welled in her eyes. He was blinded by pride. I begged him to stop. Bayezid turned away for a moment, the wind tugging at his cloak. Then he spoke again, softer, colder. "Then you shall carry the weight of his pride." He gave an order that made even his hardened soldiers hesitate. Layla was to be taken to his fortress in Bursa, not as a prisoner of war, but as a living reminder of Suleiman's defiance. The next day, as the army marched, Layla rode at the center, surrounded by guards. The villagers who saw her whispered and crossed themselves. They knew the Thunderbolt Sultan's wrath, swift and merciless. None envied the fate of the woman who had belonged to his greatest enemy. Days passed. When they reached Bursa, Bayezid's mood grew darker. He was haunted by memories, not of glory, but of betrayal. In his private chambers, he would stare at the map of Anatolia, his finger tracing the lands that had once been his allies. He told himself he was a ruler, chosen by God to bring order, yet deep inside, revenge consumed him like poison. One night, as rain lashed against the palace walls, he summoned Layla. She entered trembling, dressed in simple silk. The guards closed the doors behind her, and for a moment, the room fell silent except for the distant roll of thunder. Bayezid did not look at her at first. He was seated by the window, his gaze fixed on the storm outside. "Do you know," he said finally, "why men fear me?" Layla shook her head slowly. "They think it is because I am ruthless, because I never forgive. But the truth is," he turned toward her, his eyes burning, "they fear me because I remember." He stood, walking closer. "I remember every betrayal, every lie, every drop of blood spilled in my name, and I make sure none forget it." Layla met his gaze, her tears mingling with the flickering candlelight. "If vengeance gives you peace," she said softly, "then take it. But know this, when hate becomes your faith, even victory will feel hollow." Bayezid's jaw tightened. Her words struck something deep, something he wanted to bury. But pride would not allow mercy. He motioned to his guards. "Take her away," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "She shall live, but not as she once did." That night, the Sultan decreed that Layla be given quarters within the palace. But she was not free. She was watched, guarded, forbidden from leaving. The court whispered that Bayezid had spared her not from compassion, but from cruelty. To him, her continued existence was punishment, to live stripped of freedom, status, and dignity. Yet Layla remained silent, never begging again. She prayed each night for the soul of her dead husband, and for the man who had damned himself through revenge. Months turned into years. The wars continued, but inside the palace, another battle raged, one within Bayezid's soul. He would sometimes walk through the garden where Layla sat, always under watch. He would see her feeding birds, her face calm despite her captivity. Something about her peace unsettled him. It made him question himself, the sultan who could conquer kingdoms but could not conquer his rage. One evening, he approached her, breaking his own command. "You do not curse me," he said, his tone bitter. "Why?" Layla looked up, her eyes gentle yet sad. "Because I pity you." He froze. "You have everything. Power, armies, gold. But you live as if chained to a ghost. My husband is dead, Sultan. But you are haunted." Bayezid turned away sharply, but her words echoed long after he left. Still, his pride would not bend. He told himself she was trying to manipulate him, to weaken his resolve. But deep down, he knew she was right. When the next campaign began, Bayezid rode out once more, this time against the Crusader armies invading his western lands. He left Layla behind in Bursa, under heavy guard. Before departing, he looked at her one last time. She stood behind a lattice window, watching him go. Their eyes met. The Sultan and the captive woman who had once been his enemy's wife. Neither spoke, but in that silent gaze was everything: vengeance, sorrow, and something dangerously close to remorse. As he rode away, thunder rolled, again across the sky, the same sound that had followed him since the day he became the Thunderbolt. And deep within him a shadow whispered that the war outside was nothing compared to the one still raging within his heart. The years that followed were cruel to Bayezid, as if fate itself had turned its gaze upon the Thunderbolt Sultan to test the limits of his pride. He had crushed his rivals, silenced every rebellion, and carved his name into the soil of Anatolia with blood and steel. Yet the more he conquered, the emptier his victories felt. Every night, when the palace grew silent and the fires burned low, memories haunted him, the screams on the battlefield, the pleading eyes of Layla, and the echo of her words, "You are haunted." In his heart, he began to believe she had cursed him. News soon reached him of a new power rising in the east, Timur, the great conqueror from Samarkand. The world called him the Sword of God. To Bayezid, he was a challenge, a shadow daring to cross his empire's border. At first, Bayezid laughed when his advisors warned him. "Let him come," he said coldly. "I'll show this old wolf what thunder truly sounds like." But in the silence of his chambers, he could not laugh. There was a heaviness in his chest, a sense that destiny was approaching. Before leaving for war, he visited Layla for what would be the last time. She sat in her garden, veiled, surrounded by roses that she had planted with her own hands. Time had softened her face, but not her spirit. When she saw him, she stood and bowed her head slightly. "You still tend to the flowers," Bayezid said, his voice quieter than before. "They are the only things that listen," she replied. He looked around. The air smelled of rain. "Do you still pray for me?" "Yes," she answered softly. "Because hate is a chain I refuse to wear." Something inside him broke. For a moment, the Sultan, the Thunderbolt, felt like a man again, weary and lost. He stepped closer. "If I return, perhaps I will free you." She looked at him, not with hope, but with a sadness that saw deeper than his words. "And if you do not return?" Bayezid smiled faintly, though it did not reach his eyes. "Then perhaps God will." He left her that night, not knowing it was the last time their eyes would meet. The campaign against Timur began with thunder, true to Bayezid's name. The two greatest conquerors of their age clashed like storms. But Timur was cunning, patient, and ruthless in his own way. He watched Bayezid's pride, studied his temper, and set traps where arrogance blinded him. At Ankara, under the blazing sun of July 1402, their destinies collided. Bayezid's army, vast and fearless, met Timur's horde of horsemen and elephants. The ground trembled beneath the fury of their charge. But betrayal once again found Bayezid. Many of his allies, remembering his cruelty and pride, turned their banners mid-battle. The same mercilessness that had made him feared now left him alone. By nightfall, the thunder had died. The Sultan of the Ottomans, the man who had brought empires to their knees, was captured. When the dust settled, Timur rode through the battlefield, his gaze falling upon Bayezid. Chained and defiant. "So this is the Thunderbolt," Timur said, almost amused. "I expected lightning. All I see is ashes." Bayezid tried to rise, his pride refusing to break. "You think victory makes you greater than me?" "You are but another tyrant who will fall." Timur smiled thinly. "Perhaps, but not today." He ordered Bayezid taken to his camp. For the first time in his life, the Sultan became a prisoner, and the world he had built through blood began to crumble. In the weeks that followed, Timur humiliated him publicly. Some tales say he kept Bayezid in a gilded cage, forcing him to watch feasts where the conqueror and his generals laughed at his downfall. Others say Timur treated him with a twisted respect, calling him brother, even as he chained him. But the greatest torment was not the chains. It was memory. Each night Bayezid would dream of Layla, the woman he had kept prisoner out of vengeance. He saw her eyes, calm and pitying, as she whispered, "You are haunted." Now he understood. He had thought he was punishing her, but it was his soul that had been rotting all along. The revenge that once gave him purpose now mocked him in his cage. The thunderbolt that once struck fear into nations had struck itself. One evening, as the campfires burned, Timur entered Bayezid's tent. "You were a great ruler," he said, sitting before him. "But pride devours greatness faster than time." Bayezid glared at him, his voice hoarse. "You speak as if you know mercy." Timur's eyes darkened. "Mercy is for those who understand humility. You did not." He rose and left without another word. That night, Bayezid sat alone in the flickering light of the fire. He reached for a piece of polished steel, his reflection staring back at him. The proud eyes that had once commanded empires were hollow. He remembered the day he took Layla captive. Her trembling voice, her plea for mercy, her prayer for his soul. He whispered to the darkness, "You were right. I am haunted." When morning came, the guards found him lifeless. Some say he took poison. Others claim his heart simply broke. Whatever the truth, the thunderbolt had fallen, not by an enemy's sword, but by the weight of his own vengeance. Back in Bursa, news of the Sultan's death reached the palace. Layla was in her garden when she heard. She closed her eyes and whispered a prayer, not for triumph, not for justice, but for peace. She had suffered, yes, but she had never let hatred rule her heart. That was her victory. A few nights later, she dreamt of a vast plain beneath a dark sky. Bayezid stood there, no longer wearing his crown or armor. His face was calm, almost human again. He looked at her and spoke softly, "I am free." Then the thunder rolled one last time, fading into silence. Layla woke with tears on her face. She rose, walked to the garden window, and watched the dawn break over the mountains. For the first time in years, she smiled. The storm was over. Time moved on. The empire rebuilt itself under Bayezid's sons, and the story of his fall became legend, a warning whispered by poets and scholars alike. They said the Sultan who sought revenge found only ruin, and the woman who was wronged found peace and forgiveness. And so, history remembered them both, not as conqueror and captive, but as two souls bound by vengeance, freed only by loss. The people still speak of the Thunderbolt, the man who challenged kings, defied fate, and burned with such fury that even heaven trembled. But they also speak of Layla, the woman who outlived the storm, whose mercy outshone the fire of revenge. Because in the end it was not the sword nor the crown, but forgiveness that proved stronger than death. And somewhere, beyond the reach of mortal pride and pain, the thunder sleeps, silent at last.